Since the early 90s, with simplistic single-plane shooters like Catacomb or Wolfenstein 3D, the act of repeatedly clicking your mouse while aimed at an enemy until it keels over and dies has gotten progressively more impressive. From a technical perspective, that is. Shooting someone in a video game has never looked as good as it has in the year 2020. But for a lot of people, when it comes down to a first-person shooter, it has nothing to do with how good the game looks, or how realistic the depiction of violence is. For many people, the FPS genre seemed to peak around the mid-90s to early 2000s. Games like Doom 2, Quake, Duke 3D, Blood, Shadow Warrior were undeniably fun, yet challenging experiences. They came from a time where in an FPS, the emphasis was placed on speed, movement, fluid gameplay, and jibbing enemies. Many people find themselves fondly reminiscing about this particular era in video games. After all, the genre had been around for a couple of years up to this point, and was really starting to find its feet. The technological leap from 2.5D to fully 3D also took place within this time period as well, opening up the door to transfer the genre to brand new heights. There's just something to the act of blazing across the screen with ridiculous weapons, blasting everything and everyone away as you search for a keycard that just hits the spot. The people who were there and fondly remember this era of video game history have grown up with jobs, careers, and families by this point, with many of those influenced minds going on to work in the industry in one way or another. That's why it's not surprising that over the past 5 or so years, we've started to see a massive resurgence in the retro-styled FPS, also known as the boomer shooter, with many people creating the game they wish they had, or just desiring to revisit an age of a bygone era with the technologies that modern-day game development now allows for. From dark pixelated horror, to stalking creepy wendigos, to insane movement and front flips, we take a look into the history of one of today's most popular and influential retro throwback shooters. I sit down to talk with David Samanski, the wonderful mind behind Dusk, as he tells me all about its development history, what he was working on before it, what inspired it, how he got started, and where he's going next.
Hi, my name is David Samanski. I am a game developer, indie game developer. I made Dusk and other games that people probably haven't heard of.
How did you start making games then?
When I was, let's see, I don't even remember how old. I was in elementary school. I was like really into the game Myst, and in fact, a whole bunch of my office is Myst stuff. You can't see it, the camera here, because my camera's positioned weird. But see, but I was really into Myst, and sorry, just the camera, and we were learning this sort of presentation software for some reason. I don't know why. It seems like a weird thing to learn in elementary school, but it was sort of like a precursor to PowerPoint called Hyper Studio. And it just occurred to me one day, I'm like, holy crap, I could make something like Myst in this program. So I did, and sadly that's lost to time. I'd love to like replay it now and see what it was like. And that got me started on sort of thinking about, you know, hey, I could like make my own games. You know, it's within my power. And then I got into programming in QBasic and did that for a while, for quite a few years actually, until around college, I think, is when I got into using Game Maker and made some little games like that. And then after college, I got into using Unity, and that's when it started becoming more than just a hobby. That's when I got into, like, I made Fingerbones, which was a free horror game that took off relatively well, actually. It was sort of at just the perfect time. That's when indie horror was really big on YouTube, and so a whole bunch of YouTubers played it. And so that kind of got me thinking, hey, you know, itch.io exists. I could make something else like this for money and like actually make money doing that.
Dusk isn't just something that was thought up and created in a short amount of time. The initial idea for Dusk goes back to when David was a student in high school, with ambitions of creating his very own Quake-like game.
Although it didn't start out as Dusk, it just started out as me making a thing that looks like Quake. Eventually it became Dusk, which was the title for an FPS that I'd wanted to make as a teenager. And the only real things that remained in the released Dusk is the title Dusk and the setting of sort of being in PA, rural-ish area. As sort of I had gotten burnt out on doing indie horror games, the same sort of narrative-driven sort of walking sim-like game, and I took a little break and ended up sort of accidentally falling into developing Dusk. And I'd always wanted to make a Quake-style game since I was a teenager, basically. So I started working on Dusk, and then one day I had this little demo of all the interactions and weapons, and I think there was maybe like 1 or 2 enemies in the demo level or something. Mostly it was like a showcase of like the movement and interaction of the game and the shooting and all that stuff. And I knew that Dave Oshry, the CEO of New Blood, had worked on the 2013 Rise of the Triad remake, which I actually really liked. Which will probably come as no surprise to anyone who knows me, because I always gravitate toward janky games. It was very janky, but I really liked it. And so just on a whim, I sent him this demo, like thinking maybe he would tweet about it and help me get some more followers or something like that. And he ended up messaging me back being like, "Holy crap, can we publish this?" And I was like, "Wait, what? Who are you again? Like what? I thought you were just a guy who did." So yeah, and that's how I ended up working with New Blood. And that was, I think, the very first screenshot I have of Dusk, I think, is sometime in 2015. So there was a few months of work on it before getting involved with New Blood and before the announcement and all that stuff. Like for the the project as a whole, there were a whole bunch of different inspirations. Quake and Doom were obviously the 2 biggest ones, and then some atmospheric inspiration from like Stalker. There's some inspiration from immersive sims with the interaction you can do in the game. Just a whole bunch of I just put a whole bunch of stuff together that seemed like it would kind of fit. Cat, come on.
As art in general doesn't tend to follow a strict line of rules or rigidness, it's no surprise that video game developers also tend to do the same. When creating a game on your own, or with a small team, you're granted the ability to create things as you go, experiment freely, and be encouraged to explore different ideas and concepts, instead of following a rigid set of guidelines drawn up in the pre-production phase. After all, there is no definitive way anyone should be making games. If a certain approach works for you, then it works for you.
Yeah. Well, that's the design was very iterative. One thing that Dave continuously said during development was the idea of us building it brick by brick, which is that we didn't start out outlining this is what the whole game is going to be. It was just like one level at a time, which is that's how I work anyway. So that's how I've always worked on stuff. I sort of start at the beginning and go to the end, and in between that, it could change quite a bit from the initial idea to the finished product. Starting in episode 1, starting with episode 1, I had like a basic idea of sort of what I wanted to do and the progression I wanted it to take, as far as like, okay, episode 1 is going to be sort of in the woods. Episode 2, probably more industrial, more stalkery. Episode 3, just nonsense. But then the ideas for specific things like, Escher Labs, that idea only came about while making the Escher Labs. It wasn't ever planned. And then by the time episode 2 was done, the idea of Dusk level design going into this like weird sort of subversive messing with your brain sort of areas, that only came about because of like where episode 2 went. It was like, oh crap, now we've got to do something even crazier with episode 3. So yeah, very iterative. A lot of changing and adapting on the fly.
So you're sort of like winging the levels as you go, like just stringing pieces together.
Yeah, that was true of the individual levels also, where mostly designing them, I'd start at the beginning and work to the end of the level, and it's actually the same way Romero did episode 1 of Doom.
Yeah.
It's through designed. You just start at the beginning, go to the end, and just sort of improvise it.
So you just start off with like a vague idea and then like bring it to life as you go. That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have like ideas for, I'd like to have these sort of things in the level. I didn't outline those levels on paper or anything before I started. I didn't have like a concept art of them or anything like that. It was just sort of like, here's the vague idea, let's drop in and see what happens.
Was it a similar sort of situation when designing the enemies?
Yeah, pretty much. Again, there was some, that I had vague ideas for, like, I want to have some sort of weird bone and blood flying monstrosity thing in episode 3. Or things like that. But yeah, for the most, like, pretty much everything with Dusk, it was just designed and made as we went. There wasn't a lot of pre-planning involved.
With this approach to development, allowing for new ideas to be worked on freely, it's fair to say that not all features are going to make it into the final package. Many little tidbits of ideas and proof of concepts end up getting left on the cutting room floor, either to be picked up again for future projects, or left to collect dust in the creative vault which is the brain.
When you first sit down with the idea of a game in your head, you don't actually really know how that game is going to play and feel. You can guess, and you should guess, but the advantage to sort of designing as you go is you get to adapt to what's really the fun and the engaging part of the game. Like, Dusk did not start out with bunny hopping or jump pads, for instance. Those were added. Those were not originally. Was going to be slower, more deliberate movement. And then as we went, we discovered it's like, this is way more fun when you're flying through the air or when you're hopping around really fast and things are exploding everywhere. And so, we were able to adapt to that rather than it being like, oh, well, crap, we've already designed, all of these levels and all this around how it's supposed to play.
Is there anything from the, like, design and develop as you go phase that didn't make it in, that's sort of sitting on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, there's a few weapons that people have. Yeah. See, like, one of them's a chainsaw, and everyone's always like, man, you should have had a chainsaw in Dusk. It's like, well, there was a chainsaw in Dusk to start with, and it got cut because it wasn't fun. Oh. Like, it wasn't fun compared to the other weapons. There was also this other really weird one that was sort of it was sort of like the Devil Daggers thing, where you could hold for automatic fire, or you could click for shotgun fire, and it recharged, and the shots bounced. It was sort of just like throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And I didn't end up feeling like it was, very fun either, that it really had a place. I think that one ended up getting replaced with the mortar, which ironically you could argue is probably the least, the weapon with the least amount of place in Dusk. So I don't know if I really did solve that issue. I did kind of want to make it you fight in the tornado.
Yeah.
In E3M5, right?
Yeah, I have a funny.
Yeah, I think it's map 5, the cathedral one. I wanted to make the tornado suck you up and you have to fight guys in it, but that was way beyond what the Dusk framework would be able to handle. Other than that, I think most of the closest to that would be the gravity switching level, which I had the idea for and initially was like, that's impossible to do with this framework that I have. And then I think my brother Evan was like, why don't you just flip the entire world around the player instead of flipping the player? And I'm like, that could work. And so if I'd known how hacky it was going to be, I would have said no. But at the time, I was like, oh, that would work. I'll just do that. And so I started into it, and, you get far enough in, and it's like, well, we're doing this now, despite, the fact that the save system can barely handle it, and the fact that, like, the AI doesn't work in it, so it has to be all flying enemies, or blah blah blah, everything like that. And it's probably the concept in the game that's most underused, because I would have liked to do a whole bunch more with it. But that would require a much different framework. That would require, a framework that actually understands that gravity can be a direction other than down, and stuff like that.
When creating a AAA game, you're granted the luxury of having many people at your disposal to help aid with any unforeseen consequences or issues. The same doesn't tend to be true when creating a game with a small team, or even solo. Small issues can develop into massive time sinks as you're forced to spend many hours figuring out the root of a problem which could be solved fairly quickly if there was a large group of people working on it.
Okay, the main one that comes to mind would be light mapping issues, which I struggled with constantly throughout the game. The light mapper Unity had during that period was not very easy to work with, and it was not easy to determine why things were leaking through seams and stuff like that. And there's still a whole bunch of light mapping issues in the game. It just got to the point where it was if it's not absolutely horrible, it'll have to be good enough. The other one that has taken a lot of time post release is actually, and this is another downside to maybe doing that improvisational form of game design, is that for a lot of stuff we want to do or have done post release, the code had to be refactored. There was a significant amount of time refactoring the game to allow for localization, for instance. There is a big refactor going on. It's basically an entire rewrite of the game's code for the SDK that's ongoing. Same with Switchport, same with, during development, multiplayer. The multiplayer portion of Dusk is actually a fork of the game's code, because I didn't start it with multiplayer in mind. I started it as just this little horror shooty game, and then when it got to the point where it's we're adding multiplayer to this, it's I don't know how I'm going to adapt this. It's better to just fork the code out right now and cannibalize that to make multiplayer work. So there was definitely a lot of time spent on those sort of things, and continues to be spent on those sort of things, taking this thing that wasn't really meant to do what now we want it to do and trying to refactor it to do that.
There's a certain beauty of game development where you can take an initial idea for something and allow it to blossom into something completely different than the original intention. That holds true to Dusk's version of the BFG, but there's no massive gun shooting big streams of green energy here. Dusk has soap. Tell me about the soap.
Oh, yeah, the soap in Dusk does, I don't even remember how much damage, a huge amount of damage. It's millions of damage or something like that. And it'll kill everything in the game in one hit. That includes bosses. You can one-hit bosses with the soap. And there's a soap in every level of the game. The reason for this is that, so I needed a soap object just as a physics prop for putting in showers and stuff. So I made it. And then a friend saw the soap and they were like, what if the soap makes bubbles? I'm okay, that's a cool idea. So I put a bubble particle system on it, and I made it, the bubbles sort of hang in the air when you throw the soap, and it looks a little, kind of interesting. And so I was like, oh, this is, a little more unique looking than the other props. Maybe I'll make it do something goofy. And so I just thought it would be funny if this, innocuous looking soap actually does an insane amount of damage. And I figured that would be some secret thing no one would ever discover. But of course, during the development and early access and stuff, it became a meme. So we had to, play into that, have it in every level and stuff like that.
Yeah. As is with anything someone can create, once a game is out the door and shipped, you might find yourself wishing you had handled something a little differently. When spending hundreds of hours on something, you might not have even known there's something you could have tackled in a different way until the public gets their hands on it and plays it in ways you never would have foreseen being possible.
Yeah, there's a bunch I wish I would have done differently. Most of it related to how it was coded. Because like I said, I say we, but most of it is New Blood guys. There's limited aid that I can render in some of these things, because it's just like, what has to be done is so far above what my actual programming knowledge is. Because I'm not a very good programmer. I never have been. I'm not very knowledgeable, and I'm not very methodical or keyed into like what makes a good programmer. The sort of anal retentive obsession with details and with optimization. I basically see it as a means to an end. Like, I program because that's the way that I get a game made. So there's a lot of stuff about Dusk's code that like I don't really solve stuff as much as I band-aid it. And I'm actually quite good at band-aiding things. That's one thing, like, code-wise, I'm unironically good at is coming up with hacky, quick solutions. Sometimes that's really good because, then you can ship your product, and that's what matters most. But sometimes that's also really bad because it can mean that down the road, the good programmers look at your code and they're like, oh, this is not good. We're going to have to, do a bunch to actually make this work for this other thing. Yeah. And design-wise, or like that sort of stuff, I mean, there's definitely stuff that I intended to do differently, and then it's sort of, the game turned into something else. Like, the story was supposed to be completely different originally. But I don't know that there's anything I can think of, like, off the top of my head that I'm like, I wish I'd done this differently. Like, I regret it turning out the way it did. Maybe a few specific moments, like the climbing section of E2M4. Like, I wish that didn't exist. Or I don't know, little things like that. But for the most part, aside from some code stuff, very happy with Dusk.
After its release, Dusk proved to be a massive success for David. An idea that had been floating around in his brain since high school had finally come to fruition and had been a breakout success. It's an adored game by fans and critics alike, and with a Nintendo Switch port in the works, Dusk's journey isn't quite over yet. I asked David what he's been up to since the completion of Dusk and what he's got planned for the future.
A bunch of stuff, or several things with New Blood. Right now I'm working on Gloomwood with my friend Dylan, which it is a looking glass software, immersive sim inspired, like, Thief, System Shock 2, those sort of games, plus survival horror inspired mashup. It's a survival horror immersive sim, kind of, sort of like Victorian System Shock 2, you could say. There's a couple of little things I've tried working on my own, which I haven't finished yet. And I've done a few smaller games for the first two DreadX collections, which are sort of indie horror anthologies. But yeah, right now, I guess the big main thing I'm working on would be Gloomwood.
A big thank you to you guys for making it to the end of this look at the amazing throwback shooter that is Dusk. Another big thank you for David for agreeing to give me some of his time and being a part of all of this. All of David's links will be provided below, so if you're interested in more of his work, that's where you can find it. I know the video quality of the interview sections is kind of lackluster, but that was down to a recording issue, which I only figured out after the fact. Future videos will be a definite improvement on that front, so don't worry about that coming up. And for the people interested in supporting the show, I've now got a Patreon. For any more information regarding that, check out the link below if you're interested. There's also a link below for Twitter if you're interested in seeing updates for future content, so if you want to know more about what I'm up to, that's where you can find it. Once again, thank you for watching.